Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 3 as David has dismissed Abner in peace, and meanwhile Joab and his men have returned. So before we jump into our scene, just to situate ourselves where we are, we've been following this section here, the shape of 2 Samuel 2:1, 5-5, you can see on the right side of the screen. And we're in this section here, this purple section, the house of Saul is eliminated from contention for the monarchy, with this scene here, as Joab protests Abner's presence and Abner will end up dead. And we'll see next time that David will lead the lament for Abner, who of course was the general for his opponent Saul and had come to him just in the previous scene offering to make a covenant with him, but now he's dead. And one of the things we're going to have to be looking at is whether we believe David's dismissal of the whole thing is I and my household are forever guiltless, or whether this is all too convenient. And scholars are divided on that because the text is written in such a powerfully interwoven way of motivations of the characters and of the narrator and of the writer behind the narrator, and potentially multiple writers behind the narrator offering different viewpoints if you're following a source perspective, which I'm not. But even if you follow it as one voice, that voice is offering many perspectives and some of them deeply ironic in the big picture. So we'll be seeing that more as we go. As we've been noting, this section here in 2 Samuel 2-5, beginning of 5, is parallel to the Absalom story in 15-19, and today we'll see the sons of Zeruiah, not named as that in our immediate scene, but that's the folks that we're going to see here, Joab and Abishai and Asahel, who's already dead, and then we'll see them later in 15-19 as well. In terms of where we are, we can see on the right side of the screen that Abner was not with David at Hebron. He'd left, and that's where the scene is taking place here, where David's reign begins here in Hebron before he ends up reigning over both Israel and Judah in Jerusalem. And as we've been also noting throughout this immediate section here, not the entire unit, but especially starting with chapter 3, as we move toward the official claiming of David as king by the narrator over both the house of Judah and the house of Israel in 5:5, we see the number of ways in which the people who agree to that are designated in the text. And one of the things we've been wondering is how much of these overlap and how much of these are different. We noted last time that the Benjaminites were separate from the house of Israel, although we did not hear that they had agreed to accept David's royal authority. All we heard is the narrator said something vague about what they were planning to do, but we don't know what that is. And throughout this section, the last unit, and we looked at last video, and what we're doing today, there's a surprising silence on the part of the people that first Abner is talking to, in that case David, and now who Joab's talking to. And whether that silence is so they can't be put on the line with a view, or whether they're just holding on to see what happens, it's hard to read from silence, but that doesn't stop modern interpreters from trying to understand what's going on in David as this scene unfolds. So let's bring up the key words, and as we've been looking at, the seemingly ordinary words that are being sent or gone away are two different words here, and they're translated different ways. So even though it has sent and gone away, both in purple, it's the same word in Hebrew, and similarly dismissed and went after is all the same word in Hebrew, as well as the everyday word making, because as we saw earlier, it's common in this section because what's being made is a monarchy. So even though lots of things are being made, and we see that in the immediate scene we have here, we learn all that you are making. It says all that you are doing, but plainly the issue is making this monarchy. So let's leave that up as we begin, and we're starting in verse 22, but I left verse 21 up so we can see the sharp transition here. And if this was a TV show or a movie, what happens between verse 21 and 22 we think was too pat. It's too much of a Hollywood transition. It's not realistic. But it is what the story says. Is it not realistic because of our experience, or are we suggesting in saying that the authors have contrived a story that's not true to events? Well, we can't ever know what the events were, and it's certainly a narrative no matter what the events were. But the way it's presented here, we see the timing of Abner's leaving and Joab's returning, and they don't seem to cross in the anteroom or out on the street. So we saw David dismiss Abner and he went away in peace, and we're going to see how often that phrase is repeated. We'll see it here again and 3 times in 3 verses. So just then, omitting as it always does, Vehenna, and behold, the servants of David, or it's literally slaves of David, but we see them earlier in 2:13, 15, 17, 31, and we'll see them way later here as referring to David's people. But notice, are they Judahites? Are they Israelites? Are they anything like that at all? Or are they just simply servants of David? As we hear in Luke's gospel, you cannot serve 2 masters, but we'll see how that goes. They don't know the saying of Jesus here in 2 Samuel. So just then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, So that's where they were. We were wondering last time how Abner could get into David and where was Joab, but the narrator hadn't told us that Joab was out on a raid, bringing much spoil with him. So he's gone out in a successful raid. Notice it doesn't say who is against or whether it was a defensive thing. It seems like it's what David was doing in the first place, is just going after towns and getting their stuff, being a gangster. So we don't know any politics of this. Simply went out raiding and brought spoil. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, as we already heard. He'd been sent away in peace. As if we hadn't heard verse 21, the narrator tells it exactly the same way here. He had gone away in peace. It's verbatim the same there in both words. So now, when Joab and all the army that was with him, and the word for army here, Hatzava here, is also the word for Saul's army earlier. I noted in 1 Samuel where the Norse often had army. It wasn't army, it was simply the people. Because at that time there was no organization of troops, certainly under Saul. There was no formal administration. It was just Saul and the people around him. So they were the people, but described the Norse as army. Now it is army. And interestingly, army refers most, the word here refers most to Yahweh of translated host, Yahweh Sabaoth. But really, Yahweh of the armies or of the host of armies. So it's a military image for Yahweh that will come up in around the time of the monarchy's consolidation here in chapters 5, 6, and 7. So plainly, David is going to be made king by the Lord of armies, not the creator God, but the God who helps people in battle. And that's what we already saw in the previous scene of what Abner understood is that Yahweh had promised to use the hand of David against the hand of the Philistines. So it was told Joab, and the continuing passive conversations that we've been seeing here with messengers and others, we don't know who told Joab. Is it a good thing they told Joab? Is it to prepare him, or is it to allow him to come stealthily? It's not clear who told or why. What he's told is, Abner, son of Ner, came to the king. Notice not to David, but to the king. The previous reports had David. We see just David here, not King David, but David 4 times and 5 times in just these couple of verses on the screen, let alone previously. But now it's to the king, and he has dismissed him. Notice that the previous two were from the voice of the narrator, and this one is from the voice of the people, using the exact same language as the narrator there. So whether that's considered a clumsy element on behalf of the writer, putting in this person's mouth the words that were otherwise silently in the voice of the narrator, or just reminding us as readers how clear it was that David sent Abner away in peace. And so now Joab goes to the king. And as we hear from Robert Barron, who I noted in the introduction to 2 Samuel, is one of the most intellectually dishonest scholars of the New Testament I've ever read in my 35 years. He also happens to be a Catholic bishop of an extremely right-wing perspective. And I want to highlight him as someone who uses the text for his own purposes, completely contrary to how it's read. And that can be done from either end of the spectrum. As I've noted earlier, the scholars known as minimalists sometimes do that because their desire is to prevent Israel from having a claim to the land on behalf of the Palestinians. I'm not sure what Barron's cause is, but here's the kind of thing that he says. Joab is speaking in the cadences and tones of the serpent, unduly planting suspicion and stirring up dissension without cause. In other words, for Barron, David is a saint and Joab is the devil. But Joab is not the devil. Joab is the one who will protect David, and after Absalom's rebellion, is Joab who will bring David back to his senses before the people leave him because he's mourning over the death of the person who had been his closest rival. So Joab is central to the story and is certainly not portrayed in any way like a serpent or devil, a concept completely unknown to the 2 Samuel as well. So he went to the king and said, "What have you done?" Or literally, "What have you made?" Continuing the making theme. And of course what he's suggesting is he's made an alliance with his enemy. Abner came to you, again omitting a behold, Abner came to you, and the word for ba here suggests the sexual innuendo of came into, as Ishbaal used when he questioned Abner's going into his father's concubines. And it'll match the next verse, as Robert Alter notes, of the verb unpronounceable here, pth, to dupe or to seduce. So why did you dismiss him so he got away? Notice the shift. Not got away in peace, as we saw 3 times in Shalom, but simply so he got away, the infinitive absolute of the same verb. And as Alter notes, this ominous substitution for beshalom in the previous verses falls like the clatter of a dagger after the ringing of bells, and certainly suggests that Joab has murder in his heart, in case we didn't already suspect that. But he goes on, and let's read what he goes on to say before we listen to Polson's comment below. You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you. using the PL of this word here in the form of lafatoka here, seduce. That's the point I was just making from altar in the previous verse. Seduce. We hear it twice in Judges, and we hear it once in Deuteronomy. We also hear an interesting parallel, although it's not extended here, with the Genesis story, with Abner is to Jacob as Joab is to Esau here, complaining about somebody coming to get something from the person in authority deceptively. And we'll see many more comparisons with the book of Genesis as we go. So he came to deceive you. This is a different word for deceiving, what Jacob does to Esau. And to learn your comings and goings, or to know. And it's 6 times in these 4 verses here. I didn't list it as a key word. It's only in this immediate scene, but it's certainly a key word in this little passage we're going to have here, and we'll point it out each time. So to know your comings and your goings, and to learn all that you are doing. Again, literally all that you are making. Let's note below, the NRSV inverts the Hebrew here. The matzah, 27 times in the Masoretic text, only here in Samuel, is the place of departure, i.e. goings and comings, which is interesting here. And the comings are doubled for emphasis. So it's highlighting that Abner wants to know when you're coming and going so he can kill you. He doesn't say, Joab doesn't say that to David, but that's certainly what he's implying, that Abner's deceiving you and he's still on the side of his boss, the late Saul. But David has no response to this. Notice that Joab speaks, is told this here, then he speaks, and there's no response for David at all. Simply, Joab came out from David's presence. It doesn't say David dismissed him. It doesn't say he went off in a huff. It doesn't say David refused to answer, or that Joab left before he could answer. It just says when he left from David's presence, leaving a pregnant pause and silence between the two of them here. As my note below has, is Joab too strong for him? Or as Brueggemann suggests, is it a matter of establishing deniability? In other words, by David being silent, he can't be accused of agreeing to Joab's suggestion that Abner was deceiving him, nor to denying it. He's left with Joab just saying that, and we as the audience just hearing it. So when Joab came out from his presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah, but David did not know about it. So it's the second scene here. We're now outside of David's house, whatever house he has. We don't know much about that yet. We'll find that out in chapter 7. It's a house of cedar. But again, he sends messengers. And why would Abner respond to Joab's messengers? He certainly would be suspicious of them. Do they simply outnumber them? Is he not suspicious? There's no reason Abner would not be suspicious of Joab, especially since he knows that Joab would be seeking vengeance for Abner's killing of Asahel, who Abner did not want to kill. We recall that Abner kept saying, "Go back, Asahel, I don't want to have to kill you. How am I going to face your brother?" So Abner certainly knows that Joab would be seeking vengeance against his brother, and yet he's brought back from the cistern of Sirah, which is an interesting play on words here, according to the Abarim online dictionary. The verb Sarah means to be stubborn or rebellious, particularly of attitude, rather than active or bold, for example, Absalom later. The adjective form Sar means stubborn or rebellious. The noun Sarah means rebellion. So he's come back from the cistern of rebellion, if you will, but David did not know. So while Joab suggests that Abner wants to know David's comings and goings, David does not know Joab's comings and going. And so now that Abner has been brought back to Joab, we find a little chiasm in these last verses, and I'll scroll down so we can see the whole set of these 4 verses from 27 to 30, at least as much of it as we can see here. Framing, as you can put up on the screen here, around the death of Abner, but framed differently. In the first part, it's describing why it is that Abner died. In verse 30, it's describing why it was that Joab, and then surprisingly joined by Abishai, highlighted there, killed him. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gateway. And again, why would Abner do this? Note that Abner is silent throughout this whole thing. So both David is silent and Abner is silent. There's no protest from Abner. We'd even heard Paltiel, when he was taken from Michal and brought back to David, crying on the roadside. We saw the poignancy of that, but we see nothing about Abner's feeling, whether he's scared or whether he's being fooled or what. But he took him aside here, literally in the midst, in the gateway. It's not clear which gateway that is, presumably of David's house, but it doesn't say. To speak with him privately, or as the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon suggests, quietly or privately. Robert Alter suggests deceptively, matching deception earlier, but it could simply be privately. And there he stabbed him in the stomach. And if we hadn't seen that coming, it comes as a great surprise. It will be similar to what happens to Amasa in 2010, but it certainly recalls the death of Asahel when the spear went through his stomach and came out the other side. I'm not sure what all the stabbing in the homesh is, the stomach, but we're going to see it 3 times. So he stabbed in the stomach, and he died for shedding the blood of Asahel, Joab's brother. Again, note that it's the narrator saying the reason here. As my note below has, parochial attachment to brother overrides the commander's military sense of the appropriate, the good of the people. Within this context, David uttered a curse on Joab and his house that includes falling by the sword, a curse that will soon become important for the story in regard to Joab himself, and that from Borgen. But the story's not over yet. So afterward, and as my note from Halpern says below, the story of the assignation occupies 11 verses from 17 to 27. It requires 12 verses to exculpate David. But the story too is apology. It carefully and categorically denies that David had a motive for the murder, which is why I divide it up differently and include this through verse 30 and then 31 and following afterward. So afterward, when David heard of it, again indirectly, we don't know who told him. It certainly doesn't seem that Joab came up and told him, and because Joab doesn't appear to be in this scene where David condemns him. When David heard of it, he said, finally, someone other than Abner or Joab speaks. But who's he speaking to? Where is this scene taking place? We don't know. We assume it's in Hebron, but it doesn't say it's in Hebron. It doesn't say he's in the house or out in the street, or if he's talking to the writer or to nobody. So we have no idea who hears this harsh condemnation against Joab, but we at least listen to it. I and my kingdom, which is an interesting phrase here. How could the kingdom be guilty or not, apart from the king itself? Who is he referring to? The institution of kingdom, or all his people, all the realm? It's not clear exactly what realm David has. We were told that Abner told the Israelites that David could reign over all that his nephesh desired, all his being desired, but we don't know how much David's nephesh desires. So we don't know how wide this refers to. But all in my kingdom are forever guiltless. Ad olam, olam for forever, setting up the forever of one on the throne of David in the prophecy that Nathan reveals in chapter 7. And guiltless here, naqui, not the usual word tzaddik for innocent, but we saw it once previously in 1 Samuel, and we'll see it one more time in 2 Samuel. But guiltless before Yahweh for the blood of Abner, son of Ner. So the first thing that David wants to make clear, or the author wants to make clear, is that David is saying, I have nothing to do with the blood of Abner. But is that really true? Certainly the death of Abner is very convenient for him, as will be the death of Ishbaal, which he will also disclaim in the next chapter, as will be the death of the sons of Rizpah all the way back in chapter 21, which David is openly responsible for. But by that time, after the rebellion of Absalom, nobody's keeping track of whether David has purposely destroyed the house of Saul to prevent any rivals for his reign. So this is what he says. So after claiming his own guiltlessness, he says this. And may the guilt is not in the Hebrew. It simply says instead, using a word for whirling or dancing, may it whirl around on the head of Joab and all his father's house, notice his children, but his father's house, which would include his children, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or literally a flow, which is 15 times the Leviticus for bodily flows, but perhaps ironically used in Exodus and Deuteronomy in relation to this, for the land flowing with milk and honey. So certainly a flow that's desirable there, but here suggesting a bodily flow that is not appropriate. Or one who's leprous, also something connected to Leviticus, although Leviticus is almost certainly later than 2 Samuel. Or who, curiously, holds a spindle, using the word pelek. As Graham Old suggests, the meaning is uncertain, although the Brown Driver Griggs suggests it's what it sounds like, a spindle for weaving. Could it be a reference to women's work and suggesting that that there's someone who's gay or otherwise inappropriately behaved, although it doesn't say this is necessarily a man doing that, so we don't know about that. Or who falls by the sword, that's plain enough, or who lacks food. And the word for lack here, vahahar, is only in 1 Samuel and Samuel, 17 times in the Mesorach, but 12 times in Proverbs. And notice there's no response from Joab, whether he's here or not. And yet Joab is going to go on to continue to reign over David's army all the way through the rebellion of Absalom and through to the end. So Joab is actually not suffering anything for this. This is a public statement, or is it even a public statement? It's public to the extent that it's in the text of 2 Samuel. But it's only words that David is offering here, and there's no sense that any of these things have any effect at all. He's not claiming Yahweh for any of this. He's simply claiming Yahweh for his own guiltlessness. But he's not suggesting that Yahweh put all this on Joab. He's just wishing that these things will happen. Again, it's not that different than Isaac offering his blessing to Jacob, which was simply words that he was saying, not Yahweh's blessing, but simply positive words, just like the words he says on Esau are less positive words, neither of which have an outcome in the real world for either Jacob or Esau. And similarly, none of these words, as far as we know, have any effect on Joab. So let's follow down to our last verse here, where we hear at the other side of the chiasm, the flip side of the causation, and suddenly we hear that Abishai was involved. So Joab and his brother Abishai, last seen back in 1 Samuel 26, when he asked to kill Saul, and David stopped him, where Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. And notice how in both of these proclamations, in the one in 27, he died for shedding the blood of Asahel, and here Joab murdered him for shedding the blood of Asahel. Neither of them have to do with he died because he proposed to make a false covenant with David, or because he was Saul's general, or because he is a potential rival to Ishbaal and thus a rival to David. None of the political motivations that are plainly evident for anybody who's paying attention are named. Rather, it's simply a family blood feud that is put there. And so in our next verses, as David goes on for another 9 verses to lead the lament over Abner, just as he led the lament that began the chapter at the death of Saul, we're left to wonder, how innocent is David really as the house of Saul disappears from being a rival? We'll continue with that next time. See you then.